In the subject of urban design, in the first chapter, we will be dealing with the relationship between the architecture, urban design, and town planning. So, these three subjects, though they are very familiar to us, while architecture is our core subject and urban design is a subject which has been branched out of architecture, and town planning, another subject of expertise and specialization, are fields which are interrelated as well as differentiated from each other. So, the relationship and their coherence and their interference between each other we shall be seeing in the first chapter, followed by the perception of the city form and pattern by two renowned theories such as Gordon Cullen and Kevin Lynch, and the townscape elements as explained by them will also be discussed in this chapter. So, the relationship between architecture, urban design, and urban planning. So, what are the different roles of these three different subjects? So, architecture isn't the reflection of the state of the society, it's the reflection of the mind. So, it's the creation of the human environments which are amicable and suitable to a given end user or a group. So, the art or the practice of designing and constructing buildings are architecture. We all know and we all practice it day to day. So, these architecture takes three different characteristics such as function, which is fundamentally to provide shelter, that is a cover or an enclosure to a space, with a form and art that is appreciated by for its beauty, and then firmness, the stability of the structure. So it should be functional and it should have an aesthetic value and should have the capacity to withstand. So these three F's form the main role and scope of architecture and design. So, what is urban design? The design of functionality of spaces between the buildings and the structures. So, in urban design, the perspective is not one space, it is many spaces. It is over a cityscape or a townscape. It is over a area which is to be dealt at a macro level and not at a micro level. So, a group of many elements in this macro space, such as your buildings, the circulation pattern between them, the traffic movement between these elements, the usability of these spaces, and the connection to one place to another, and the way in which we perceive each of this space and the way we direct it with some legibility and clarity in mind forms the study of urban design. So, what is urban design? It is the making of places for people. So, isn't architecture not the same? It's the same, but it's making for place for people. But this is making of places for people. The human interaction within the environment. It involves public spaces such as squares, piazzas, streets, pedestrian precinct, etc. A street is a spatial entity and not the residue between the buildings. So it forms as a continuous as well as sequential connectivity between many of the spaces interlinked to each other to form a pattern such that the buildings are organized and suitably placed. And it is definitely not placing of the buildings and finding the residual space and calling it as pathways or streets. So, the third subject of interest, urban planning, the design and the organization of the urban space and infrastructure. So, what is urban planning? The layout of the neighboring residential environments, cities, and the regions, fulfilling the needs of the community and the economy. So the balancing the built and the natural environment. So basically it deals with the location, organization, arrangement, articulation and interference of many of the land uses such as residential, commercial, industrial, educational, institutional, and also the open spaces such as agricultural lands, pastoral lands, your landscaped areas, your public domains, etc. So it is the layout and the arrangement and the organization of the spaces so that it fulfills the community as well as the economy of that space is in a potential manner. So if you tell a man by his shoes, you can tell a city by its pavements. So it's a very, very dramatic statement that when you look at how the pathways, the pavements of the city, the pedestrian pressings along the roadway, the design of that, then you can say how rich and how well designed the city is. So tabulating these three studies, architecture, urban design and urban planning, in form of three parameters. One is the scale. So the scale is the individual building that we are talking about in architecture. In urban planning, it's the spaces between the buildings, that is the streets, parks and the transit stops, etc. Whereas in urban planning, it's the neighborhoods, it's the districts, it's the city, it's the town planning we are talking about. So in architecture, when we deal with orientation as a scope or a role of an expert, we say aesthetics and functionality is the role of an architect and an urban designer as well. But when it comes to urban planning, it's the interlink of utility between the social, economic and the environmental goals of the public areas. So in architecture, we treat a space in 2D and we deal it as well as in 3D. But in an urban design, we deal only in 3D, that is a eye-level perspective of every space. In urban planning, we predominantly deal only with 2D because we are more concerned with earmarking of the spaces of utility value. Architecture, we have a time frame based on the project schedule or a project budget or an end user's requirement. Urban design is a short term planning of less than 5 years because it deals with the immediate requirement of a particular community to develop its public spaces or to develop its spaces of immediate requirement of accommodating the social change of that particular space. But urban planning is a long-term planning of 5 to 20 years of planning the change that the environment has to acquire because of the change in the economic or the environmental value of that particular space. What is urban planning? Since urban design and urban planning are a lot more interlinked with each other, we shall differentiate urban design from urban planning by knowing a little more about urban planning. Urban planning is a technical and a political process concerned with land protection and use of the environment, deals with infrastructure planning, transportation, communication and distribution of networks. So a typical land use map demonstrates different land uses with the arterial and subarterial roads, with the main roads, with different spaces of public buildings mentioned in red. The green areas are the agricultural wetlands, pastures, grasslands. The purple indicates the industrial areas. The orange indicates the mixed used areas. The yellow is concerned with the residential communities, and the blue is the commercial chunks of land between the residential areas. So, the transportation network deals with a web of connectivity, differentiating the hierarchy of the various roads that lead and penetrate like veins into the urban spaces. So, this is the plan of the future of the urban areas. So, the urban design deals with the look and the feel at which all these spaces can be developed with a public functional space in between them, avenue of roads, the treatment of the roads, the landmarks that needs to be created, the nodes that differentiate the various roads that leads to the legibility of taking orientation from one road to the other, at the same time maintaining the economic and environmental value of this particular space. Planners work to ensure that cities have what they need to grow and prosper. So, what is urban design? Urban design is a process of giving form, shape, character to a group of buildings, to the whole neighborhood and the city. It is a framework that orders the elements into the network of roads, streets, squares, and blocks. So, urban design has various statements which define its role. It's the art of making spaces, it's the process of giving form and character to a particular space, the connection between people and space, so you connect with a particular cultural as well as a visual aspect to that particular center using a landmark, how buildings are scaled and oriented towards the road, so the legibility of finding the orientation of the road is well established. So it is the framework that orders the elements into a network of streets, squares, and blocks, the public areas that are hierarchically organized in order to find a match to the eye level of the end user, to suit himself and to make him habitable as well as make him accustomed and familiar to that particular space. So the stops are landscaped to buffer between the pedestrian and the vehicular circulation. It is a way or a character of urban designing this particular avenue road. So architecture as defined by many renowned architects such as Norman Foster, I.M. Pye, etc. So it's the mirror of life, as Pye said, and it's the expression of values, as Norman Foster said, and Corbusier said it's like masterly correct and magnificent play of forms under the light. So giving life to a human environment is architecture. So in summary, when we see the three studies, when we have to define urban design, the best way is to predict the future is to design it. If architecture is a frozen music, then urban planning is a composition and urban design is a street performance. So it is the presentation of the entire design component of the various spaces put together and composed in a way it could be read or understood by the public. So it renews the sense of local pride and identity, and it adds value to the spaces, especially cities and towns. Urban design is not just what it looks like, urban design is how it works. So now that we have understood the relationship between architecture, urban design, and urban planning, we shall see what this study of urban design is into. The urban design is concerned with the arrangement, appearance, and function of our suburbs, towns, and cities. So the way we feel all these places, such as our suburbs, cities, and towns, is what is actually urban design. It operates in many scale, macro scale to micro scale. So in macro scale, the urban structure such as planning, zoning, transportation, and infrastructure networks, to the micro scale of street furniture designing, to lighting, to landmarks, etc., to landscaping. When fully integrated into policy and planning systems, urban design can be used to inform land use planning, infrastructure built form, and even the socio-demographic mix of a place. So, urban design is a process of designing and shaping cities, is what we understood from its definition. So, the public spaces, the whole neighborhoods, and the districts have to be designed in a way that the large scale is actually brought down to a small scale, which is tangible or touchable by a human. So, in the process, the creating the localities where the people live, engage each other, interact with each other becomes important. So, how they interact with each other is a location which we call it as a public space. The interacting space or the commutable space are the transportation system, and the usable and the utility oriented amenities to these spaces are the services and the amenities which add to it. So the connection between the people and the places, and the movement and the urban form, the nature and the built fabric, etc., is what is making urban design very much essential in many strands of placemaking, environmental stewardship, social equity, and economic viability. So it is important not only for making of spaces, but to make it viable and economic, as well as it has to have a racial and social equity among the public. At the same time, the protection to the environment is also one of the important aspects of this design of urban spaces. So urban design can significantly influence the economic, environmental, social, and cultural outcome of the spaces. It encourages people of business and entrepreneurship. It attracts people to live there. Whether the cost of the housing and the travel are affordable, whether how to access the job opportunities, how the facilities and services are equitable, how people can habit a particular space, is all dealt with urban design. So, urban design determines the physical scale, space, and the ambience, and it establishes the building and the natural forms. So, although it affects the balance between natural ecosystems and built environments and their sustainable outcomes, although the urban design is often delivered as a specific project in a long term process that continues to evolve over time. It is this layering of building, infrastructure, natural ecosystems, communities, and culture that give places their unique characteristics and identities. Well, these 4 points are actual, identical, typical prototype of any particular space, but this is always not an order. The overlaying pattern of the infrastructure, the natural ecosystems, the cultures, and the communities are not dealt with in the order it is mentioned. It is always a mixed match, a miscomposition, and there are many issues and scope of objectives that raise out of these issues, which we will be dealing in the following slides. So the urban design is influenced by the health, social, and cultural impacts, and how these people interact with each other, how they move around, and how they use the spaces. So based on all this, how do we envision the space, urban space? So the image of the city was defined by Kevin Lynch. So Kevin Lynch, he came up with this book called as Image of the City, where he talks about a particular statement on page 46, which is very, very apt to urban design. That is, the public image of any given city is the overlap of many individual images. So each individual image is unique. So it is rarely communicated or never communicated to the public in different environments. It is more compelling or less embracing. That is, if you take a public image, like how a designer looks, that is never communicated to the public who actually uses it, because the way the public envisions an urban space is entirely different and it is very less embracing. But people are always miscommunicated of an urban space. So, how do we mismatch this gap? Is what he says in the image of the city, and he gorges down a lot of uh, statements and definitions and concepts which we will be seeing in the following slides. He was an American planner, urban planner, and an author, and he has done 2 books which include The Image of the City and What Time Is This Place. He has done many other books, but these 2 are very much important for urban design. So, The Image of the City, this book is about the look of the city, whether this look of any importance, whether it can be changed. So, in the new concept of legibility and imageability, though these are not words that we find in dictionary, these are the 2 concepts that he talks about in the first half of the book in a very, very detailed manner, where the reconnaissance and the comparisons between each other, and he divides them into 5 elements, and the interrelationship between the 5 elements, he writes it as the core content of the book. So the first 2 concepts of legibility and imageability. Imageability is actually a picture, especially in the mind. Everybody has a picture of a city in its mind. When we think of Mumbai, we think of the Marine Drive. When we think of Delhi, we think of Imperial Delhi. When we think of Chennai, we think about the Indo-Saracenic buildings and the beachscape. When we think about Bangalore, the cold climate, the landscaped avenues, etc. When we think about Kolkata, we come across harbors, we come across many imperial buildings during the English rule, etc. So every city has installed an image in each of our minds. So this is a picture. It's an imaginary picture to the users, the citizens, the people who have dealt with these cities. So he says there are 2 processes between the observer and the observed. So the observer, with great adaptability and light of his own purpose, selects and organizes his way of looking at the spaces. But whereas the process of being observed is what is cannot be judged by a designer. So the specific image that can totally be different from the perspective of the observer is the imageability. That is the ability to create an image in the end user's mind. He says that. So when you take a grid pattern, nobody walks in straight lines. We take the shortcut to reach the end point. So the finding devices such as maps, street numbers, route signs, placards, etc. leads only to getting lost, but in simple geographical uncertainty is achieved only when the person feels the space and says how well we can connect to these spaces to orient oneself. So this leads to the next term, which is legibility or clarity. So to make it more clear, the imageability is nothing but influenced by a 2-way process between the observer and the observed. So the observer with great adaptability and light of its purpose looks at a particular space which a specific image is actually very different in perspective to what he has to observe it as. So in order to make it legible to him, he has to visually grasp the related pattern and the recognizable symbol of a legible city. So, the related pattern and recognizable symbol. How do you visualize this related pattern and recognize the way in which you have to adapt and identify the overall pattern? So this, he says, is by pathways, landmarks and districts, nodes. So the principles of effective wayfinding, he lists down some of the points. Create an identity at a location, such as a landmark or a artifact or a roundabout or a grotto. Use these landmarks to provide orientation or clues. So this creates a structured paths. So the path that leads in hierarchy of roads, such as the large roads, smaller roads, and as well as the intertwining roads. So between these roads, regions are created. So when you navigate between, you choose to navigate and use the survey views, such as the vistas. Vistas are nothing but visuals. So the regions create visuals. Some of them can have low-rise buildings and create low vistas, and the high-rise buildings are the rare of it. So they use the sight lines to see what is at the back and what is at the foreground. And also the wayfinding decisions points, such as your direction finders, also help in wayfinding. So this imageability is actually the quality in a physical object is imageability. It's evoking a strong image in an observer. That is, you have to awaken that image in the observer. That is, he creates mental images which are highly useful for him and which helps him to identify the vividness of the space and the shape and the arrangement and the color of these particular landmarks, wayfinders, cues, hierarchy of regions, vistas, as well as your regional outlooks and your well-structured paths, your visual character of any region, all helps to create a mental image for him to act to a particular instant and make a decision to orient himself in a particular space. So the 5 basic elements which help to create or construct or form the mental image. So this mental image which creates the imageability of the city is the pathways, districts, edges, landmarks and nodes. So the pathways are your well-structured paths. The edges are the ones which stops further movement. The district is a particular region in which is intertwined between the path and the edges. The node is a point where there are 2 intersection of paths and the place where you have to make a decision. And landmarks are the clues in which help you to make an identification and a visual mental image of a particular space. So for example, if your arterial roads and your subarterial roads are your expressways, are your paths. Your beaches, forests, mountains are your edges. The regional city that we call differentiate between the urban as well as the towns are the districts, and the intertwining conjunctions between the paths where the expressways and the subarterial roads meet, where you need to take a diversion, is explained very legible as a node, and the landmarks that create historical, cultural, social, and economic value to any built environment of a city will actually judge and create a mental image, or the imageability as he clearly defines in his book. So the paths are the channels. So these can be defined as streets, walkways, transit lines, canals, or your railroads, or your uh, metro lines, anything. The edges are the linear elements which are not used as paths. They are shores, or they are railroad cuts, or they are mountain ranges, or they are the canyons, or they are the edges of development, etc. So the districts are from medium to large sections which the observer mentally enters the inside of and recognizable as having some common and identifying character. A region of similar character which we call it as a city, such as a Coimbatore city, a Chennai city. So nodes. Nodes are points, strategic spots into which an observer can enter and which are intensive focal point or foci to and from he is traveling, primarily junctions and concentrations such as these. Landmarks are another type of point reference. In this case, the observer does not enter within them. They are external, they are usually rather simply defined physical objects, and they are signs, store, or mountains. For example, you take a particular city such as Dublin, where the landmarks are defined as spots. The paths are the different hierarchical circulation of roads. The districts are the likewise regions such as the residential regions, mixed use regions, commercial regions, public, uh, central business districts, etc. The edges are the railway lines, or the pattern beyond which development is a little difficult or hindered or obstructed. The nodes are the concentrations or a junction between two hierarchical paths. The green spots, when overlapped on these yellow lines, you can find them. So the elements of urban design. So what is the different elements that make urban design? So urban design is the arrangement, appearance, and the function of suburbans and towns and cities. It's the outcome of creating localities. It involves design and coordination of making cities and towns. So these buildings, public spaces, streets, transport, and landscape all form the major elements of urban design. So buildings, which we dealt with in architecture, the space between the buildings which is used for human interaction is your public spaces. The pathways that are circulatory forms between your buildings that form the streets, and the transit pattern or the interaction pattern between the buildings and the public spaces is the transportation, and the landscaping spaces, which are the lungs or the breathable respiratory spaces of any city, all form the elements of urban design. So buildings, as we know, that they are the most pronounced elements of the urban design, the outcome of architecture. They shape and articulate a space and forming a street wall of the city. Well-designed buildings are the group of buildings work together to create a sense of space. So they are residential in nature, commercial, institutional, or educational, or government, or industrial parks. So the public spaces are a living room of the city where the people come together and interact with each other. So the public spaces add high value to the city, and also it's the stage of drama of life, backdrop of the drama of life, and also these can range from central plazas to large squares to small local neighborhood parks as well. So this is an example of of a public space such as a plaza, the St. Peter's Square in Vatican City. So the Times Square, a most happening place in New York, or the Plaza Manar in Spain, Madrid. So the Manila Bay Walk, the way in which the public space developed very adjacent to that of the water body. The streets, the element of urban design, are nothing but the connection between the spaces and the places. So it gives a physical dimension, character, and the size and the scale defines what the streets are. The pattern of the street network is what a city is defined as. So, the street examples, such as the main street, is the focal point of shops and retailers and central business district, and the high street, how they call it in the Western context, is the primary business district, business street of many towns. The fourth street is actually confined in Portland and United States, etc., for colonists, that is, people of colonies. The overpass is your expressways, and the underpasses and the overpasses. So the skyway is also the expressway to connect one place to another without any great interruption. So this example of skyways. So the freeways, where you travel without a lot of hindrance to traffic, where you just freely move with full ease at very great speed to commute one place to another. The boulevards are large roads running through the cities, and the multi-lane arterial thoroughfares with medians and center for gatherings, some pedestrian pathways, some parking lines and bicycle lines, pedestrian usage and quality of landscaping and scenery are all boulevards. Avenue roads are traditionally the straight route with large shrubs and trees on either side. So the esplanade is nothing but the promenade where you walk and have a look at a great scenery on one side. So the alleys are the narrow passageway between the buildings. It is also the narrow streets in front of houses and business areas. It is paved pedestrian, and it is often wall to wall between buildings. So the transportation, it connects between cities, it connects between places, it can enables movement and interaction and commutation between one space to another. So it makes it either friendly, hostile, uh, hostile to pedestrians. So your roadways, your train stations, which are major nodes or landmarks as well, and your bus stations, your bus rapid transit systems, your taxi lines, then your rickshawalas, the paramedical paratransit systems, and private automobiles, your bicycle lines, the sidewalks, which are very essential pedestrian pathways, which form part of your NMT, your non-motorized transport, and then your landscape. So landscape is a green part of the city which weaves the form of urban parks, street trees, plants, as well as the ecosystem in many forms. So the green spaces in the city is from the grand parks to small pockets of strip parks within any neighborhoods. So the Central Park is a great example of one of the largest parks in New York, a great place to live. So boulevards, So the landscaping along your streets, the walkways, the lawns. So urban design weaves together these elements and makes it coherent, organized design structure. Coherent, organized design structure. So the apt placement of these ingredients in the right place, the right point of time, with the right use and the proportion of these elements leads to a good design.